You can think of an other something. So something and other are, in the first place, both determinate beings or somethings. Secondly, each is equally an other. It is immaterial which is first named, and solely for that reason called something. Otherness thus appears as a determination alien to the determinate being thus characterized, or as the other outside, or is the other outside the one determinate being, partly because a determinate being is determined as other only through being compared by a third, and partly because it is only determined as other on account of the other which is outside it, but it is not an other on its own account. At the same time, as has been remarked, every determinate being, even for ordinary thinking, determines itself as an other, so that there is no determinate being which is determined only as such, which is not outside a determinate being and therefore is not itself an other. So I want to unpack this a bit, and it has a contradiction here. Because on the one hand, you have, otherness, right? And otherness is only otherness by comparison. Um, you know, we have the book and the television, right? And I'll go a slide over. The something is a book, the other is the television, or not a book. So we have the television is the other, by my comparing it to the book. It's not the other in its own right, but just in this relationship, I'm putting it in with the book. So that's one aspect, is that this television is a television in this relationship, and by my comparing the television to the book. So it's not always the other. Like if I took the television outside of this relationship, it would not be the other. And also, I want to go back here for a second. There's also a sense that this could be the something, and this could be the other. So that in a way, I'm the one who's making the book the something and the television the other. I'm doing this. And at the same time, though, he says every determinate being, even for ordinary thinking, determines itself as another, so that there is no determinate being which is determined only as such, which is not outside a determinate being and therefore is not itself another. So I was saying here that, the something is a book and the other is a television or not a book. But here I can say the something is the television and the other is the book. So I could alternate these two. They could switch places. There's an alternation that could happen here. And likewise, I am, as the one presenting this, I'm the one who's determining which is something and which is the other. But on the other hand, remember that for everything to have specificity, for everything to have a unique quality, to have the sense of unique quality to something, it has to be an other in itself. So for instance, this book has to be other than everything else in order for it to be a book. Or likewise, think about me as a person, my sense of individuality, the fact that there's only one me, there's only one version of me, I'm a unique person, comes from the fact that I myself determine myself as another to everyone else. So I'm not, my brother Eric, or I'm not my friends, or I'm not other people. I also say that I am not other people. I am myself, and I am not other people. So we have these two senses of the otherness is both something that's I can assign, and it can be arbitrary. So, something and other can alternate. And likewise, especially every person determines themselves as an other by saying that they're unique and that they are not other people. So otherness, we all have otherness as well. So we have these two contradictory, contradiction when it comes to otherness. And so Hegel goes on, both are determined equally as something and other, and are thus the same. And there is so far no distinction between them. But the self-sameness of the determinations likewise arises only from external reflection, from the comparing of them. But the other as at first posited, although an other in relation to the something, is nevertheless also an other on its own account, apart from the something. And that's kind of what we were saying, they can switch places. As we see in this slide, the something is a book, and then the something becomes the television. But likewise, every unique individual says, I am not my brother Eric, I am not my mom, I am not my father, I am not my friends, I am myself. So we have this contradiction here. And how is Hegel going to solve this? And Hegel says the other simply by itself is the other in its own self, hence the other of itself, and so the other of the other. It is, therefore, that which is absolutely dissimilar within itself, that which negates itself, alters itself, but in doing so, it remains identical with itself. For that into which it alters is the other, and this is its sole determination. But what is altered is not determined in any different way, but in the same way, namely to be another. In this latter, therefore, it only unites with its own self. It is thus posited as reflected into itself with sublation of the otherness, as a self-identical something from which consequently the otherness, which is at the same time a moment of it, is distinct from it and does not appertain to this something itself. And I want to unpack this here because this is a very important idea in Hegel, and this move that he does here is so crucial to understanding the Hegelian dialectic. So we had these alternating things. We had something and the other, the something became the other and the other became the something. So to solve this, and he's going to take otherness and let's think of what otherness what happens with otherness when we hold it away from this, right? So what would happen if we we go back to this relationship here and we took away this book and we just said the other is not a book, or the other is not a book, right? We're going to take otherness outside of this relationship and see what happens to it. So Hegel says that the other becomes, actually I'm going to go back here. He says the other simply by itself is the other in its own self, hence the other of itself, and so the other of the other. It is therefore that which is absolutely dissimilar within itself, that which negates itself, alters itself. So we take the other and we take it away from this relationship of something and other and see what the other is in its own self. What is the other by itself outside of the relationship with something? And so he says the other simply by itself is the other in its own self, hence the other of itself, and so the other of the other. So we can think of this as the other, the television. And the other, this is the other with nothing to be an other to. So there's no book for it to be an other to. It's the other with nothing to be an other to. So the TV is no longer an other. So if this were the other and it has nothing to be an other to, it is no longer the other. So now it is the other of the other, or not the other. So just by being the other of the other, or other than the other, not the other, and we can always think of other as not, right? So by being not the other, it also has an other to otherness. So the contradiction of this is even though the television has nothing to be an other to, it has become the other to otherness itself. So otherness is both united with the TV, but also distinct from it. And as we see, otherness is a relation as opposed to something that exists independent of all relations. So, and as we look at this TV, the other, which becomes the other of the other, what is there for this to be an other to? If it is held apart from everything else, it loses its sense of otherness, and at the same time is an other to what it was as an other. So this is the contradiction. It's a lot to, it's a little bit complicated, but just think of this as it was not the book, and now it's without the book here, it's not the book. So it's almost like a negative times a negative making a positive number. You can think of that, right? So it becomes the TV in its role as other. Without the book, the television becomes different from what it was when it was the other. It thus becomes the other of what it was in the role as the other. So it becomes other to what it was as the other. So this is, um, you know, it's changing. And Hegel's dialectic is very dynamic. There's a lot of movement here. So um, Hegel goes on, something preserves itself in the negative of its determinate being. It is essentially one with it and essentially not one with it. It stands therefore in a relation to its otherness and is not simply its otherness. The otherness is at once contained in it and also separate from it. It is a being for other. So here we have this new term, being for other. So instead of the television just being an other, right? Um, you know, it has two aspects of itself. So something and another, no longer are they alternating, but the television has this aspect of itself where it exists as for being another. So determinate being as such is immediate, without relation to another, or it is in the determination of being, but is including within itself non-being. It is determinate being negated within itself, and then in the first instance an other. But since at the same time it also preserved itself in its negation, it is only being for other. So we saw that when we tried to isolate otherness, it had nothing to be an other to. And so it became the other of the other, which the other of the other, you can think of the other of the other in two ways. On the one hand, the other of the other is like a negative times a negative. The other of the other is a self. And on the other hand, it contains otherness within it. Just like a negative times a negative number is a positive, but it contains negative numbers in it. Um, so this allows it to retain otherness as well as seeing how otherness depends upon relations to other things. So it preserves itself as the negative of its determinate being and is being, but not being in general, but as self-related in opposition to its relation to other, as self-equal in opposition to its inequality. Such a being is being in itself. So now we have, instead of something in the other, now we have being for other and being in itself. And being for other is this sense where, the being exists in relations to others, and being in itself is something that's um, self-related in opposition to its other. It's a sense of, in some ways, um, it it's the opposite of being for other. It's what something is in itself. Like the book is the book in itself, or the television is the television in itself. So being for other and being in itself constitute the two moments of something. There are here present two determinate pairs of determinations, something and other, and being for other and being in itself. The former contain the unrelatedness of their determinations, something and other fall apart. And we saw that something and another fall apart when the something became the other became the something. Um, and even otherness, when held apart, became being for other, and then we saw being for in itself. So, something and another fell apart, but their truth of their relation, being for other and being in itself, are therefore the above determinations posited of moments of one in the same thing, something, as determination, which are relations and which remain in their unity, the unity of determinate being. Each, therefore, at the same time also contains within itself its moments which is distinguished from it. So something and other were opposed to one another, and they alternated. The book was the something, the television was the other, then the television was the other, and the book was the something. I mean, they alternated. But now we saw that the book has this sense of being for self, and it's the being for other of the television. And likewise, the television is the being for other of the book, and the television also is has being in itself. So I want to move on here. So two aspects of something, being for other, this is a sense that kind of sets it apart, and being for self, which is, the sense of that exists, or being in itself. And actually, this is being in itself, not being for self. So that's a different thing in Hegel, but this is actually being in self. So, we can think of this too as, so we saw that being in itself and being for other are aspects of the same thing. So being and nothing in their unity, which is determinate being, are no longer being and nothing. These they are only outside their unity. Thus, in their unstable unity, in becoming, they are coming to be and ceasing to be. The being in something is being in itself. Being, which is self-relation, equality with self, is no longer immediate, but is only as the non-being of otherness, as determinate being reflected into itself. Similarly, non-being as a moment of something is in the unity of being and nothing, not negative determinate being in general, but in other, and more specifically, seeing that being is differentiated from it, at the same time a relation to its negative determinate being, a being for other. So remember, we can't have being without nothing. We can't separate being from nothing or hold these two things apart from one another. They're always they're going to find a way to combine with one another. So, and he says that, being in itself, this aspect is at the same time the other of being for other. It is it is an other in the relationship with being for other. So, and that's a contradiction in itself, that being in itself becomes the other for being for other. And I'll show this in a next picture here. But he goes on, hence, being in itself is first a negative relation to the negative determinate being. It has the otherness outside it and is opposed to it. Insofar as something is in itself, it is withdrawn from otherness and being for other. But secondly, it also has present in it non-being itself, for it is itself the non-being of being for other. And being in itself is like the negative number multiplied by the negative number and equaling a positive number. This is, its product is positive, but it comes out of negativity, and it is itself the negative of the negative number. So this is the whole way we got to being in itself was negation. It comes out of negativity, or negation. So, and he goes on, but being for other is first a negation of the simple relation of being to itself, which in the first instance is supposed to be determinate being in something. Insofar as something is an other or is for an other, it lacks a being of its own. But secondly, it is not negative determinate being as pure nothing. It is negative determinate being which points to being in itself as to its own being, which is reflected into itself, just as conversely, being in itself points to being for other. So we can't have being in itself without being for other, and we can't have being for other without being in itself. We need these two things, even though they're opposites, they need each other to exist. You can't have inside without having an outside, and you can't have an outside without having an inside, right? The two, even though they're opposite, they need one another. And it's kind of like that. And I'm going to show in some slides to unpack the idea of being in itself as being the other to being for another, and being for other needing the being in itself. It points back to being in itself. So, we have this being for other, right? Think about being for other as something that exists with, this tree. The being in itself is the tree itself, right? And the being for other is this part that I can see it, I can feel it, I can smell it, I can think about it. And this really goes back to some philosophers skeptics who said we can never know what a thing is in itself. We can only know what we the kind of it that we perceive, that we and some of the skeptics really held apart what something was in itself and what something was as it existed for other people. So like a skeptic would say, we can never know what the tree really is. We can only know what we sense of the tree or what we experience of the tree. And Hegel actually has a problem with the statement like that, because The being in itself, right, is itself the other of being for other. It is not, um, the being in itself is not the being for other as we experience. So it has otherness within it. It itself is an other. It is an other to the way that we see it, we feel it, we smell it. So this being in itself is at the same time the other of this being for other. It is the it is the I'm going to make a little note here that so it is the other of being, because it is not being for other, it is the other of, the being in itself is the other of being for other, right? It is not this. And likewise, um, Hegel goes on and says, but being for other is a negation of the simple relation of being to itself, which in the first instance is supposed to be determinate being in something. Insofar as something is an other or is for another, it lacks a being of its own. But it is not negative determinate being is pure nothing. It is negative determinate being which points to being in itself as to its own being, which is reflected into itself. So remember, this isn't just pure, this part that we this being for other that we experience isn't just pure nothingness. It exists, it has its own being. We you know what we see, what we feel, what we smell, it exists. It is a being. So this in itself is not mere nothingness, but what we see, feel, and smell also has being. So Hegel's saying that, being itself is the other of being for other, or a negative relation to being for other. And being for other also, it exists. We see the tree, we smell the tree, we think about the tree. This is not mere nothingness, but the being for other actually exists. It exists for us. So it's not mere nothingness. And we can think of this, I want to think about this relationship of being in itself and being for other. So, being in itself is not being for other, like I said, therefore, it is the other of being for other and contains otherness in it. So, and being for other cannot exist without being in itself. We, that's, they need each other to exist. You can't have the outside without the inside. And that's how, you can think about this. A way of thinking about this would be, think of being for other as the outside and being in itself as the inside. We need the outside to have the inside, as this picture illustrates. So without the outside square, the inside square ceases to be the inside square. And likewise, the outside square needs the inside square to remain the outside square. So that's another way of thinking about this, that being for it in itself and being for another, they need each other to be in this relationship. Being for other without the being in itself isn't being for other. Being in itself, or being for other without being for other without being in itself is not being for other. And likewise, being in itself with no being for other is not being in itself. um and as we said earlier, the being in itself is the other of the being for other, so it has otherness. And likewise, the being for other, it exists as we see it, feel it, and smell it. So each of these turns into its opposite. And this is like really another Hegelian move, is that each thing turns into its opposite, as we've seen. And each time it turns into its opposite, we have a new way of thinking about it. So remember, we had quality and negation in the last video, where something was what it was and something was what it isn't. What something was, that kind of, there was some contradiction there, which led to something and other. There was alternation, the something became the other became the something. We learned out of that that something and other aren't opposed to one another. They're aspects of something. So something has its being in itself and its being for another. They They're not just something and other as opposed to one another. They're two aspects of the same thing. So each time we get to a contradiction, it helps us, we learn something new about it. And we get like a more concrete understanding of what something is. So Hegel goes on, both moments are determinations of what is one and the same thing, namely the something. So it has being in itself and being for another. Something is in itself insofar as it has returned into itself out of being for other. But something also has in itself, and here the accent falls on in or within it, a determination or a circumstance, insofar as the circumstance is outwardly in it, is a being for other. So something has in itself or within it a determination or circumstance insofar as the circumstance is outwardly in it. Remember, the being in itself is the other of the being for another. So it has otherness in it. This leads to a further determination. Being in itself and being for other are, in the first instance, distinct, but that something also has within it the same character that it is in itself. And conversely, that what it is being for other, it also is in itself. This is the identity of being in itself and being for other, in accordance with the determination that the something itself is one, and the same something of both moments, which therefore are undividedly present in it. So, here he's saying that, they're at first they're distinct, but that something also has within it the same character that it is in itself. And conversely, that what it is as being for other, it also is in itself. So remember, being in itself had being for other in it, or had otherness in it. So we've learned that even these two aspects of something can change up. Um, Things are called in themselves insofar as abstraction is made from all being for other, which means simply insofar as they are thought devoid of all determination, as nothings. So if we hold in itself, like what something is in itself apart from everything else, it turns into nothing. In this sense, it is, of course, impossible to know what the thing in itself is. For the question what demands that determinations be assigned. But since the things of which they are to be assigned are at the same time supposed to be things in themselves, which means in effect to be without any determination, the question is thoughtlessly made impossible to answer, or else an absurd answer is given. The thing in itself is the same time as that absolute of which we know nothing, except that in it all is one. What is in these things in themselves, therefore, we know quite well. They are, as such, nothing but truthless, empty abstractions. And so we go back to this picture, right? And we think about, the in itself, if the in itself would be the tree, this sense of the treeness, and then there's, everything, we see it, we feel it, we smell it, you know, without the being, without the seeing it, feeling it, smelling it, without its being for other, the in itself, like, it has no bearing, it has no meaning. you know the tree being green, the tree being smelling a certain way, the tree feeling a certain way, the brown, you know the brownness of the tree, maybe the autumn leaves of that are on the tree, all these things that aren't the tree in itself also are, what we use to describe the tree. And being for other is, you can think of being for other in this way, is that being for other, um there's a tree as it is in itself, and then there's it's being for other, which is the way it looks and smells and feels and maybe taste, or whatever, like this parts that the rest of the world experiences. But the tree in itself, if we're talking about as apart from how it looks and how it feels and how we experience it, if we just talk about the tree independently of how it looks, smells, feels, we learn nothing about the tree, and it's meaningless to talk about the tree without how it looks, smells, feels. Without the being for other, it would be pointless to talk about what things are. So in this, Hegel goes on, in the sphere of being, determinate being only proceeds from becoming, or with the something an other is posited with the finite, the infinite, but the finite does not bring forth the infinite, does not posit it. In the sphere of being, the self-determining even of the notion is at first only in itself or implicit. As such, it is called a transition, and the reflected determinations of being such as something and other, or finite and infinite, although they essentially refer to each other or are as a being for other, they too count as qualitative, as existing on their own account. The other is, the finite ranks equally with the infinite as an immediate affirmative being, standing fast on its own account. The meaning of each appears to be complete even without its other. On the other hand, positive and negative, cause and effect, however much may be taken as isolated from each other, are at the same time meaningless one without the other. There is present in them their showing or reflection in each other, the showing or reflection in each of its other. So he's going a little bit ahead here. He's getting into essence, which is a little ways off. But being qualitative being, what something is, you can hold it apart from what something is not. You can hold, a tree being a tree apart from the tree being a house or the tree being a road. Um, you can't do that though with other things like positive and negative cause and effect. So um, Hegel goes on, and he's getting a little bit ahead here. So don't put too much emphasis on this as we're going on it, but it does show us what's going to happen going forward. He says, being for other is in the unity of the something with itself, identical with its in itself. The being for other is thus present in the something. The determinateness thus reflected into itself is therefore again in the simple form of being, and hence again equality, determination. So since the in itself, the being in itself had otherness in it, since in itself had other being for other in it, and being for other, had this, since each becomes its opposite, we have to have a new way of looking at this. It's not just that something has an aspect of being in itself and an aspect of being for other. We need a new way of looking at this. And Hegel goes on, the in itself, which something is reflected into itself out of its being for other, is no longer an abstract in itself, but as negation of its being for other is mediated by the latter, which is thus its moment. So remember, he said, the in itself is mediated by the being for other. It is not the being for other. In itself has otherness in it. So it's mediated by the latter. In itself is not merely in itself. In itself is the other of being for other. And like I said, the tree in itself is not merely the in itself of the tree, but it's also the green leaves and the wood, the brown wood, and the smell it has. Maybe for an animal, it may even have a certain taste. So the in itself has has otherness in it. It is not only the immediate identity of the something with itself. The tree isn't merely a tree, but the identity through which there is present in the something that which it is in itself. Being for other is present in it because the in itself is the sublation of the being for other, has returned out of the being for other into itself. But equally too, simply because it is an abstract and therefore essentially burdened with negation, with being for other. There is present here not only quality and reality, determinateness in the form of simple being, but determinateness in the form of the in itself. And the development consists in positing this determinateness as reflected into itself. So like I was saying, the tree isn't merely the tree, the in itself, but the tree is also has an aspect of it to where the green leaves and the brown wood and the way it smells, are essential for the tree in itself. The in itself is the other of being for other. It has otherness in it. It comes out of being for other. You can't get to the in itself without going through the being for other, as we've seen in this. So he ends this by saying, the development consists in positing this determinateness as reflected into itself. And this is where he's going to go next. So I hope that this helped, and thank you.